Sarah Martinez walked through the crowded coffee shop, her sleeve rolled up just enough to reveal the edge of a detailed tattoo on her forearm. The morning rush was in full swing, and she needed caffeine before her job interview at the tech company downtown. At 26, she had learned to dress conservatively for professional settings, but the summer heat made long sleeves unbearable. As she waited in line, she noticed the whispers starting behind her. Two women in business suits were staring at her arm, their voices low but not quite low enough. "Look at that girl with all those tattoos," one of them said, shaking her head. "How does she expect to get a decent job looking like that?" "Probably some gang member," the other replied. "These young people have no respect for themselves. My daughter would never." Sarah's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes forward. She had heard it all before. The assumptions, the judgments, the way people looked at her ink and immediately decided who she was. They saw the elaborate design covering most of her right arm, and made their conclusions without knowing anything about her story. The tattoo was beautiful and intricate, depicting a military scene with incredible detail. There were soldiers in combat gear, a helicopter in the background, and what looked like a memorial with names etched into it. The artwork was professional, clearly expensive and obviously meaningful. But all most people saw was a young woman who had made poor choices. Behind her, more comments followed. A businessman in the expensive suit muttered to his colleague, "Companies should have dress codes that prevent this kind of thing. It's unprofessional." An elderly man shook his head disapprovingly. "In my day, only criminals and sailors had tattoos. Now these kids think it's fashionable." Sarah ordered her coffee and moved to the pickup area, trying to ignore the stares and whispered comments. She pulled out her phone to check the time and accidentally bumped into someone waiting beside her. "Sorry," she said, looking up to see a woman about her mother's age wearing scrubs. The woman's eyes immediately went to Sarah's tattoo, and her expression hardened. "You know," the woman said coldly, "my son is serving overseas right now, putting his life on the line for people like you. The least you could do is show some respect for what our military families go through instead of turning your body into a canvas for attention." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She felt tears threatening to form in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Ma'am, Save it," the woman interrupted. "I know your type. All about rebellion and making statements until you need someone to protect you." Sarah's coffee was called and she grabbed it quickly, eager to escape the hostile environment. As she headed toward the door, she heard more comments from various customers. "Probably on welfare too," someone said. "Parents must be so proud," another person added sarcastically. "What's next? Face tattoos." The weight of their judgment felt crushing. Sarah had worked 2 jobs to put herself through college, graduated with honors in computer science, and had been interview-ready for months. But none of that mattered to these strangers who saw only her tattoo and made their assumptions. Outside the coffee shop, Sarah sat on a bench and took deep breaths. She looked down at her arm, at the tattoo that meant everything to her but seemed to mean nothing but trouble to everyone else. The detail was stunning. Every line, every shadow had been carefully crafted by one of the best tattoo artists in the city. It had taken multiple sessions and cost her months of savings, but it was worth every penny. She thought about covering it up for the interview, but the day was already sweltering, and she had learned that hiding who she was never led to happiness. If a company wouldn't hire her because of her tattoo, maybe it wasn't the right place for her anyway. As she walked toward the downtown business district, Sarah passed more people who stared, pointed, and whispered. A group of teenagers snickered, and one of them said, "Look at the tough girl with her prison tattoos." Their laughter followed her down the block. At a crosswalk, an older gentleman in a veteran's cap looked at her arm and shook his head sadly. "Young lady," he said, "I fought in Vietnam so you could have freedom, but I never thought that freedom would be used to disrespect the military like this." Sarah wanted to explain, wanted to tell him her story, but the light changed and the crowd moved forward. She felt more alone than ever, carrying the weight of everyone's assumptions and judgments. The tech company building loomed ahead, all glass and steel reaching toward the sky. Sarah knew that inside she would likely face more of the same reactions. HR representatives who would try to hide their disapproval, interviewers who would focus more on her appearance than her qualifications, colleagues who would whisper about her behind her back. She paused at the building's entrance, looking at her reflection in the glass doors. The tattoo was clearly visible, the military scene detailed and meaningful. But she knew that most people would never bother to look closely enough to understand what it really represented. Sarah had spent years perfecting her skills, building an impressive portfolio, and preparing for opportunities like this. She had recommendations from professors, projects that demonstrated her abilities, and a passion for technology that had driven her since childhood. But all of that seemed secondary to the ink on her skin. Taking one final deep breath, Sarah pushed through the glass doors and approached the reception desk. The security guard looked at her arm, and his expression shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed judgment. "I'm here for an interview," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. "Name?" he asked, his tone colder than it had been with the previous visitor. As Sarah gave her information and waited for her escort to the interview floor, she couldn't help but wonder how many more times today she would have to endure the stares, the whispers, and the assumptions about who she was based solely on the art that decorated her skin. The interview had gone better than expected, despite the initial shocked expressions when Sarah entered the conference room. The hiring manager, Jennifer Walsh, had clearly been taken aback by the tattoo, but had quickly composed herself and focused on Sarah's qualifications. After an hour of technical questions and portfolio reviews, Jennifer seemed genuinely impressed with Sarah's skills. "We'll be in touch within a week," Jennifer had said, though her eyes kept drifting to Sarah's arm throughout their handshake. Now, 3 days later, Sarah sat in her small apartment, laptop open as she continued her job search. The rejection email from the tech company had arrived that morning, citing cultural fit as the reason. She knew what that really meant. Her phone buzzed with a text from her roommate Lisa. "How did the Starbucks interview go today?" Sarah had taken a part-time job at a local Starbucks to pay rent while searching for full-time work. Even there, she faced daily comments and stares from customers who seemed personally offended by her appearance. "Same as always," Sarah typed back. "Manager hired me but wants me to wear long sleeves even in summer." The apartment felt stifling in the afternoon heat, but Sarah had grown accustomed to covering up. She pulled on a thin cardigan and headed out for her shift, dreading another day of hiding who she was. The Starbucks was busy when she arrived, the afternoon crowd demanding their caffeine fixes. Sarah tied her apron over her covered arms and began taking orders, trying to maintain a cheerful demeanor, despite feeling exhausted by the constant judgment. A group of college students approached the counter, chatting loudly about their classes. When Sarah turned to grab cups, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing a glimpse of her tattoo. One of the students noticed immediately. "Oh my God, did you see that?" The girl whispered to her friends, not quietly enough. "The barista has like a whole army tattoo. That's so weird for a girl." "Maybe she's trying to look tough," another student replied. "Some girls think military stuff makes them look cool." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she prepared their drinks. She had heard variations of these comments hundreds of times, but they never stopped hurting. The assumption that her tattoo was some kind of fashion statement or attempt to appear tough showed how little people understood. As the day wore on, more customers noticed when her sleeves shifted or when she reached for something high on a shelf. A businessman waiting for his order commented to his friend, "I don't understand why companies hire people who look like that. It sends the wrong message to customers." An older woman receiving her latte looked directly at Sarah and said, "Honey, you're such a pretty girl. Why would you ruin your body like that? You'll regret it when you're older." Sarah smiled politely and thanked her for the advice, as she had been trained to do. Customer service meant accepting whatever comments people felt entitled to make about her appearance. During her break, Sarah sat in the stockroom and pulled out her phone. She scrolled through job listings, each one requiring professional appearance standards that seemed designed to exclude people like her. The tech industry claimed to be progressive and inclusive, but her experience suggested otherwise. A knock on the stockroom door interrupted her thoughts. Her manager, David, peered in with a concerned expression. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Her heart sank. "Is this about the tattoo?" "Because I've been keeping it covered like you asked." "It's not about coverage," David interrupted. "It's about customer complaints. I've had 3 people today ask to speak to management about your appearance. One woman said she felt uncomfortable having someone with gang tattoos handle her food." Sarah felt the familiar sting of tears behind her eyes. "David, it's not a gang tattoo. If people would just look closely. I know, Sarah, you're a great employee and I don't personally have a problem with your tattoo. But corporate is breathing down my neck about customer satisfaction scores. They're suggesting that maybe you'd be better suited for a position in the back, doing inventory or cleaning. The implication was clear: hide her away where customers couldn't see her, where her appearance wouldn't offend anyone's sensibilities. Sarah had worked hard to get a position dealing with customers, using her communication skills and friendly personality. Being banished to the back felt like defeat. "Can I think about it?" Sarah asked, though she already knew what her answer would be. "Of course. Take your time." The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Every customer interaction felt heavy with judgment, every glance at her covered arm a reminder of how society saw her. When a teenage boy pointed at her sleeve and whispered to his girlfriend about those military wannabes, Sarah finally reached her breaking point. After clocking out, Sarah walked home through the city center, her cardigan clinging to her in the humid evening air. She passed a military recruitment office with posters of proud soldiers in the window, and the irony wasn't lost on her. These same people who thanked service members for their sacrifice were the ones judging her tattoo without understanding its meaning. At a bus stop, she overheard a conversation between two women discussing their children. "I told my daughter that if she ever gets a tattoo, she's out of the house," one woman said. "It's just trashy, especially on women." "What kind of message does that send?" "Exactly," the other agreed. "And those military-themed ones are the worst. It's like they're trying to claim honor they never earned." Sarah's chest tightened. If only they knew the truth. If only any of them took the time to understand the story behind the ink that covered her arm. Back in her apartment, Sarah sat at her kitchen table and stared at her reflection in the black window. She slowly rolled up her sleeve and looked at the tattoo that had become both her most treasured possession and her biggest obstacle. The detail was breathtaking. Every face was recognizable, every piece of equipment accurately rendered. The helicopter's rotor blades seemed to move in the right light, and the names on the memorial were clear enough to read. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a masterpiece of art and memory, but tomorrow she would cover it again. She would hide it beneath long sleeves and cardigans, pretending to be someone she wasn't so that strangers wouldn't feel uncomfortable. She would smile politely at their ignorant comments and accept their assumptions about who she was. Sarah picked up her laptop and continued her job search, scrolling through listings that all seemed to require the same thing: the appearance of someone completely different from who she really was. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah started working in the Starbucks stockroom, hidden from customers who might be offended by her appearance. The isolation was wearing on her, spending hours alone sorting inventory and cleaning equipment while listening to the chatter of customers and co-workers through the thin walls. Today was different, though. David had called in sick and the assistant manager had asked Sarah to cover the front counter during the lunch rush. She hesitated, knowing the long sleeves would be unbearable in the heat, but she needed the hours. The lunch crowd was particularly demanding, with business people grabbing quick coffees and office workers escaping their cubicles for a brief respite. Sarah kept her cardigan buttoned despite sweat beading on her forehead, determined to avoid any incidents that might get her sent back to the stockroom permanently. Around noon, a group of corporate executives entered, their expensive suits and confident demeanor marking them as important clients who probably spent more on lunch than Sarah made in a week. They ordered complicated drinks with multiple modifications, speaking loudly about stock prices and merger deals. While preparing their order, Sarah reached for a bottle of syrup on a high shelf. Her cardigan caught on the espresso machine, and for a brief moment her sleeve pulled back, revealing a portion of her tattoo. "Jesus Christ," one of the executives said loudly enough for half the cafe to hear. "Look at that thing on her arm. What is this place hiring?" His colleagues turned to stare, their expressions ranging from disgust to amusement. Sarah quickly adjusted her sleeve, but the damage was done. "Is that supposed to be some kind of military thing?" another executive asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "What's next, hiring people with face tattoos?" The third man, older and clearly the senior member of the group, shook his head disapprovingly. "This is exactly what's wrong with young people today. No respect for institutions, no understanding of what real service means." Sarah's hands shook as she finished their drinks, trying to ignore the growing audience of customers who had stopped their conversations to watch the spectacle. The executives continued their commentary as if she weren't standing right there. "My nephew just enlisted in the Marines," the first man said. "Real courage, real commitment. Not like these posers who get tattoos to look tough." Probably thinks it makes her look patriotic, the older man added. Has no idea what real sacrifice looks like. Other customers began joining in the conversation, emboldened by the executive's loud criticism. A woman in yoga clothes nodded vigorously. I've been saying this for years. These kids appropriate military imagery without understanding what it represents. It's disrespectful to our troops, added a man wearing a polo shirt. My brother served 3 tours in Iraq. He would be disgusted by this kind of display. Sarah set their drinks on the counter with trembling hands, trying to maintain professional composure while her world crumbled around her. The entire cafe had become an impromptu forum for discussing her character and fitness to exist in polite society. Thank you, she managed to say, her voice barely audible. The senior executive picked up his drink and looked directly at her. Young lady, I hope you understand that tattoos like that will prevent you from ever having a real career. No respectable company wants employees who make such poor decisions. The group left, but their words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Other customers continued to stare and whisper, some taking photos with their phones when they thought she wasn't looking. A teenage girl with her mother approached the counter next. The mother kept glancing at Sarah's covered arm as if she could see through the fabric. Mom, the teenager whispered. Is that a gang tattoo? I don't know, honey, the mother replied, not bothering to lower her voice. But it's certainly not appropriate for someone in customer service. Sarah took their order mechanically, her mind elsewhere. She thought about all the job interviews where hiring managers had seemed enthusiastic until they noticed her tattoo. She remembered the HR representative who had actually suggested she consider tattoo removal if she wanted to advance her career. The afternoon wore on with more stares, more whispers, more judgment from people who knew nothing about her story. A group of college students debated whether tattoos should be banned in food service. An elderly couple discussed how military symbols had been cheapened by young people who used them as fashion statements. By closing time, Sarah felt emotionally drained. She had endured hours of commentary about her character, her judgment, her respect for the military, and her fitness for employment. Each comment chipped away at her confidence and her sense of belonging in the world. As she cleaned the espresso machine, her coworker Jessica approached with a sympathetic expression. I heard what happened today, Jessica said quietly. Those guys were total jerks. You shouldn't have to deal with that. It's fine, Sarah replied automatically, though nothing about it was fine. No, it's not fine. You're one of the hardest workers here, and you know more about coffee than anyone. What you have on your arm doesn't change that. Sarah appreciated Jessica's kindness, but it didn't erase the day's humiliation. She finished her closing duties in silence, wondering how much longer she could endure the constant judgment and criticism. Walking home through the downtown area, Sarah passed a military surplus store with a Support Our Troops banner in the window. The irony was overwhelming. The same society that claimed to support military personnel was treating her like a social pariah because of the artwork on her arm. At a crosswalk, she overheard 2 women discussing her as she waited for the light to change. Did you see that girl's tattoo in Starbucks today? One asked. Disgusting, the other replied. I don't understand why businesses hire people like that. It makes the whole place look unprofessional. Sarah crossed the street quickly, eager to escape their voices, but their words followed her home like unwelcome companions. In her apartment, Sarah sat on her couch and slowly rolled up her sleeve, looking at the tattoo that had become her scarlet letter. Every detail was perfect, every element meaningful, but none of that mattered to the world outside her walls. She picked up her laptop and opened her email, scrolling through the rejection letters that had accumulated over the past few weeks. Not the right fit. Concerns about professional appearance, cultural, alignment issues. All polite ways of saying that her tattoo made her unemployable. Sarah closed the laptop and leaned back against the couch cushions, wondering if she would ever find a place where she could be herself without hiding, where her skills and character mattered more than the art on her skin. 3 months had passed since the incident at Starbucks, and Sarah had finally found a job at a small tech startup that prided itself on being progressive and inclusive. The interview process had been different. The founders, both young entrepreneurs, had seemed more interested in her coding abilities than her appearance. When they offered her the position of junior developer, Sarah felt hopeful for the first time in months. The startup occupied a trendy loft space in the arts district, with exposed brick walls and standing desks scattered throughout the open floor plan. On her first day, Sarah wore a light, long-sleeved shirt, still cautious about revealing her tattoo, despite the company's supposedly relaxed dress code. Her new colleagues were friendly enough, though she noticed the curious glances when her sleeve rode up slightly during meetings. The work was challenging and engaging, exactly what she had hoped for when she chose computer science as her major. For a few weeks, Sarah began to believe she had finally found a place where she could belong. That illusion shattered on a Friday afternoon when the company's biggest client, a conservative financial firm, arrived for a crucial presentation. Sarah was part of the development team scheduled to demonstrate the new software they had been building for months. The client representatives were exactly what Sarah expected from a traditional financial company: older men in expensive suits who carried themselves with the authority of people, accustomed to having their opinions matter. The startup's founders, Mark and Jenny, greeted them with nervous enthusiasm, clearly aware of how much this contract meant to their young company. "This is our development team," Jenny announced, gesturing towards Sarah and her 3 male colleagues. "They've been working incredibly hard on your project." As introductions were made, Sarah kept her arms carefully positioned to avoid revealing her tattoo. She had practiced her part of the presentation dozens of times and felt confident about the technical aspects of the demonstration. Everything went smoothly, until the air conditioning in the old building malfunctioned, sending the temperature soaring. Within minutes, the loft became uncomfortably warm, and people began rolling up sleeves and loosening ties. Sarah tried to maintain her long sleeves, but as she operated the laptop for the demonstration, perspiration made her shirt cling uncomfortably to her arms. During a particularly complex part of the presentation, Sarah reached across the table to adjust the projector angle. Her sleeve caught on the corner of a binder and pulled back, fully exposing her tattoo for the first time in the professional setting. The reaction was immediate and devastating. The lead client representative, a distinguished man named Robert Kingston, stopped mid-sentence and stared at Sarah's arm. His expression shifted from professional interest to obvious shock and disapproval. "What is that?" he asked, his voice cutting through the suddenly quiet room. Sarah quickly adjusted her sleeve, but it was too late. "It's a tattoo, sir." "I apologize if I can see that it's a tattoo," Kingston interrupted. "What I want to know is why someone with military-themed body art is working on our financial software." Mark and Jenny exchanged panicked glances. The contract they were hoping to secure was worth more than their company's annual revenue to date. "Mr. Kingston," Mark began carefully, "Sarah is an excellent developer. Her personal choices don't affect her professional abilities." "Personal choices?" Kingston's voice rose slightly. "This isn't about personal choices. This is about judgment and professionalism. How can we trust our sensitive financial data to someone who displays such poor decision-making?" Sarah felt the familiar weight of judgment settling on her shoulders, but this time it wasn't just affecting her. It was threatening her colleagues' livelihoods and the company's future. Another client representative, a woman named Patricia Wells, leaned forward to get a better look at the tattoo. "Is that supposed to be some kind of military scene? Are you a veteran?" "No, ma'am," Sarah replied quietly, her voice barely audible in the tense room. "Then why would you get a tattoo like that?" Wells asked, her tone suggesting that this was somehow relevant to their software needs. "It seems inappropriate to use military imagery if you haven't served." Kingston nodded vigorously. "Exactly my point. This shows a fundamental lack of respect for our armed forces. How can we trust someone with such questionable values to handle our clients' financial information?" Sarah wanted to explain, wanted to tell them the real story behind her tattoo, but the words wouldn't come. She had learned from months of similar encounters that explanations rarely changed people's minds once they had formed their opinions. The third client representative, a younger man who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should focus on the technical aspects of the presentation." But Kingston was already gathering his papers. "I think we've seen enough. This level of unprofessionalism isn't what our firm is looking for in a technology partner." "Please," Jenny said desperately, "let's not let this derail our discussion. Sarah's appearance has nothing to do with the quality of our work. It has everything to do with your company's judgment." Kingston replied coldly, "If you're willing to put someone like this in front of clients, what does that say about your business practices?" The meeting ended abruptly, with the financial firm representatives leaving without scheduling a follow-up. The room fell silent except for the sound of the malfunctioning air conditioner rattling in the background. Sarah sat frozen at the table, knowing that her tattoo had just cost her colleagues a life-changing contract. Mark and Jenny tried to maintain professional composure, but she could see the disappointment and frustration in their eyes. "Maybe we should talk about this privately," Mark said after the clients had left. In the conference room, Sarah faced her employers across a table that felt as wide as an ocean. She had prepared for this conversation hundreds of times in her mind, but now that it was happening, she felt completely unprepared. "Sarah," Jenny began gently, "you're a talented developer, and we value your contributions to the team." The word "but" hung in the air unspoken. "However," Mark continued, "we need to consider the impact on our business relationships. Most of our potential clients come from conservative industries: finance, insurance, healthcare. They expect a certain level of professional presentation." Sarah nodded, understanding where this was heading. "Are you asking me to leave?" "We're asking you to consider your options," Jenny said carefully. "We could look into tattoo removal programs, or perhaps you could work remotely, handling back-end development where client interaction isn't required." The suggestion of tattoo removal hit Sarah like a physical blow. They were asking her to permanently alter her body to fit their business needs, to erase something that meant everything to her for the comfort of strangers who would never bother to understand its significance. "I need to think about it," Sarah said, standing from the table. "Of course," Mark replied. "Take the weekend. We can discuss this more on Monday." Sarah gathered her things and left the office, knowing she would never return. As she walked through the arts district, surrounded by galleries and studios celebrating creative expression, she felt the bitter irony of her situation. Even in a space dedicated to art and creativity, her particular form of expression was deemed unacceptable. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment and looked at job listings, already knowing what she would find. Every position would require professional appearance, and every interview would end the same way once her tattoo was discovered. She had spent years developing her skills, building her knowledge, and preparing for a career in technology, but none of that seemed to matter as much as the art on her arm and society's interpretation of what it meant. 6 months after leaving the startup, Sarah had given up on finding work in her field. The pattern was always the same: promising interviews followed by rejection once her tattoo was discovered. She had taken a job at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, working the night shift where fewer people would see her and make comments. The Moonlight Diner attracted an eclectic crowd of truck drivers, shift workers, and insomniacs seeking coffee and conversation in the lonely hours between midnight and dawn. Most customers were too tired or too focused on their own problems to pay much attention to Sarah's appearance, which made the job bearable if not fulfilling. Tonight felt different from the moment Sarah arrived for her shift. The day manager, Carol, met her at the door with an unusual expression of excitement mixed with nervousness. "Sarah, honey, I need to tell you something," Carol said, pulling her aside before she could put on her apron. "We're getting some VIP customers tonight. There's a military ceremony happening at the base tomorrow, and some high-ranking officers are staying at the hotel next door." Sarah's stomach tightened. Military personnel often had strong opinions about civilians wearing military-themed tattoos, and those opinions were rarely positive. "They specifically requested a quiet place to have a late dinner and discuss tomorrow's events," Carol continued. "The hotel restaurant is closed for renovation, so they're coming here. I need you to be extra careful about your appearance tonight." "Do you want me to stay in the kitchen?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer. "Actually, no. Jenny called in sick, so you're the only server I have. Just keep your sleeves down, okay? These are important people, and I can't afford any complaints." Sarah nodded and tied her apron over her long-sleeved uniform shirt. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being asked to hide her tattoo from the very people it was meant to honor. The dinner rush was quiet until around 10 o'clock, when a group of 6 men in dress uniforms entered the diner. Even in civilian clothing, their bearing and demeanor would have marked them as military officers. In full dress uniform, they commanded attention and respect from everyone in the restaurant. Sarah approached their table with menus, keeping her arms carefully positioned to avoid revealing any part of her tattoo. The officers were polite and professional, discussing logistics for the next day's ceremony while reviewing the simple diner menu. "Coffee all around?" Sarah asked and received nods from the group. As she poured coffee and took their food orders, Sarah couldn't help but listen to fragments of their conversation. They were planning a memorial service for fallen soldiers, discussing the families who would be attending and the importance of honoring those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. The senior officer, whose name tag read Commander Mitchell, had a gravitas that spoke of years of experience and difficult decisions. His voice carried the weight of someone who had personally delivered bad news to military families and understood the true cost of service. "The Henderson family will be there tomorrow," he was saying to another officer. "Their son was in my unit, 19 years old, died trying to pull his wounded sergeant to safety." Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she refilled his coffee cup. The conversation was hitting close to home in ways these men couldn't possibly understand. For the next hour, Sarah served their table while trying to remain invisible and professional. The officers discussed the ceremony details, shared memories of fallen comrades, and talked about the importance of ensuring that sacrifice was never forgotten. During a particularly busy moment, Sarah was carrying a tray of food to another table when a drunk customer at the counter stood up too quickly and bumped into her. The tray tilted, hot soup splashing toward her arms. Instinctively, Sarah pulled back and raised her arms to protect herself, causing her sleeves to ride up and fully expose her tattoo. The drunk customer stumbled away, mumbling apologies, but Sarah remained frozen with her arm exposed. Several patrons turned to look, including the table of military officers. She quickly lowered her arms and adjusted her sleeves, but the damage was done. "Hey, look at that," the drunk customer said loudly, pointing at Sarah's covered arm. "The waitress has some kind of army tattoo. Probably thinks she's a soldier." His words carried across the quiet diner, and Sarah felt the familiar weight of judgment settling over her. She braced herself for the comments that always followed, the assumptions and accusations from people who didn't understand. Commander Mitchell stood up from his table and walked slowly towards Sarah. His expression was unreadable, and she prepared herself for another lecture about respecting military symbols or appropriating imagery she hadn't earned. "Miss," Commander Mitchell said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made the entire diner fall silent. "Could I see your arm, please?" Sarah's heart raced. This was it, the moment when a real military officer would publicly humiliate her for her tattoo, validating every criticism she had endured over the past year. "Sir, I know what you're thinking," Sarah began, her voice shaking. "I know it looks inappropriate, but please," Commander Mitchell interrupted gently. "Just let me see it." With trembling hands, Sarah slowly rolled up her sleeve, revealing the full extent of her tattoo. The detailed military scene came into view. Soldiers in combat gear, a helicopter, fallen comrades, and the memorial with names etched into black granite. Commander Mitchell studied the tattoo in complete silence, his eyes moving over every detail with an intensity that made Sarah feel exposed and vulnerable. The other officers had risen from their table and approached, forming a small circle around her. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Sarah waited for the criticism, the lecture about respect and appropriation, the judgment that had become so familiar. Instead, something unexpected happened. Commander Mitchell's expression softened, and his eyes moved to a specific section of the tattoo, the memorial wall with its carefully rendered names. His breath caught slightly, and he leaned closer to examine the intricate detail. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A shop downtown," Sarah replied, confused by his tone. "It took 6 sessions to complete." "No," Commander Mitchell said, still staring at the tattoo. "I mean, where did this image come from? This isn't a generic military design." Sarah's mouth went dry. She had hoped to avoid this conversation for as long as possible, but there was no escaping it now. "It's from a photograph," she said quietly. "What photograph?" one of the other officers asked. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would change everything. "A photograph of my brother's unit in Afghanistan," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "The memorial wall shows the names of the men who didn't come home." The words hung in the air like a revelation that changed everything. Commander Mitchell's eyes widened as he looked more closely at the tattoo, his gaze now focused and intense in a completely different way. "Your brother," he repeated slowly. "What was his name?" Marcus Martinez, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. Sergeant Marcus Martinez, 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. The effect on the group of officers was immediate and profound. Commander Mitchell stepped back slightly, his hand moving unconsciously toward his chest in a gesture of respect. The other officers exchanged glances filled with understanding and recognition. Martinez, one of the younger officers, said quietly, "I remember that name from the casualty reports." Commander Mitchell studied the tattoo again, this time with the reverence of someone looking at a sacred memorial. The intricate details that had seemed like mere artistic flourishes to others now revealed themselves as accurate representations of real people, real places, real sacrifice. "Tell me about this photograph," Commander Mitchell said gently. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she began to speak, her voice shaking with emotion she had kept buried for months. "Marcus sent it to me 3 weeks before he died," she said. "It was the last picture he ever took. He's the one standing next to the helicopter, third from the left. The other men in the picture were his brothers, his family. When the IED went off, Marcus threw himself on top of his sergeant to shield him from the blast." She pointed to specific figures in the tattoo, her finger tracing the detailed artwork. "That's Corporal Johnson, he was 19. That's Private Rodriguez, 21. Staff Sergeant Thompson, he had 2 kids. Marcus was 23 when he died trying to save Thompson's life." The diner had fallen completely silent. Other customers had stopped eating, stopped talking, stopped everything to listen to Sarah's story. The drunk customer who had started this revelation sat quietly at the counter, his earlier mockery replaced by sober attention. "The memorial wall," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she shared the story she had kept hidden for so long. "Those aren't random names. They're the men from Marcus's unit who didn't make it home. 7 names total. I had each one researched and verified before the artist added them." Commander Mitchell leaned closer to examine the names on the memorial portion of the tattoo. His expression grew more solemn with each name he recognized. "Henderson," he said quietly, reading one of the names. "Private First Class Tyler Henderson." Sarah nodded. "You mentioned the Henderson family earlier. Tyler was Marcus's roommate. They joined up together, went through basic training together. Marcus wrote about him in every letter." The commander's composure wavered for a moment. "Tyler Henderson was the 19-year-old I mentioned, the one who died trying to save his sergeant. That was my brother," Sarah said, tears now flowing freely. "Marcus was Tyler's sergeant. Tyler died trying to pull Marcus to safety after the first explosion. Marcus died in the second blast trying to protect the medic who came to help them both." The silence that followed was profound and respectful. Every person in the diner understood they were witnessing something sacred, a moment of recognition and honor that transcended typical social interactions. Commander Mitchell looked at Sarah with new eyes, seeing not a rebellious young woman with questionable judgment, but a sister carrying the memory of a hero who had paid the ultimate price for his service and his brothers in arms. "How long did this take to complete?" another officer asked, his voice filled with respect. 8 months from start to finish," Sarah replied. 6 sessions for the tattoo itself, but months of research beforehand. I interviewed other members of the unit who survived, studied photographs, worked with the artist to make sure every detail was accurate. I wanted it to be perfect, to honor not just Marcus but everyone who served with him." She rolled her sleeve higher, revealing additional details that had been hidden. "The coordinates tattooed here are the exact location where they fell. The date is engraved in military time format. Even the helicopter model is accurate to what was used in their missions." Commander Mitchell studied these additional elements with growing amazement and respect. "This isn't just a tattoo," he said quietly. "This is a memorial. It's the only memorial some of these men have," Sarah said. "Tyler Henderson's family couldn't afford a proper headstone. Rodriguez's parents live in poverty in Mexico and couldn't travel to see where their son was buried. For some of these families, this tattoo is the only place where their sons are remembered alongside the brothers they died with." The weight of this revelation settled over everyone present. Here was a young woman who had been judged, criticized, and ostracized for months, carrying the names and faces of fallen heroes on her body as a living memorial to their sacrifice. One of the younger officers, a lieutenant whose own chest bore military decorations, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I want to apologize on behalf of everyone who misjudged you. This is one of the most honorable things I've ever seen." Sarah shook her head. You don't need to apologize. How could you have known? I look like just another civilian with a military tattoo. No, Commander Mitchell said firmly. You look like a Gold Star sister who has chosen to carry the memory of fallen warriors with dignity and respect. There's a difference, and anyone with military experience should recognize it. The other customers in the diner began to understand what they were witnessing. The truck driver who had been eating alone at a corner booth approached the group. Miss, I'm a veteran myself, he said quietly. Vietnam era. I want to thank you for honoring our fallen this way. It takes courage to carry that kind of responsibility. More customers approached, offering words of respect and apology for any judgments they might have made. The drunk customer who had pointed out her tattoo initially approached with tears in his eyes. I'm sorry, he said simply. I had no right to say what I said. My own son is deployed overseas right now. If something happened to him, I would hope someone would remember him the way you remember your brother. Sarah accepted their apologies with grace, understanding that their initial reactions came from ignorance rather than malice. She had learned over the past months that most people simply didn't understand what they were seeing when they looked at her tattoo. Commander Mitchell returned to studying the artwork, his military mind appreciating the accuracy and attention to detail that had gone into creating this permanent memorial. The artist who did this work, he said, they must have military experience. Actually, no, Sarah replied. But he spent weeks researching with me, studying photographs, consulting with veterans. He said it was the most important work he'd ever done. He refused payment for the last 2 sessions, said it was his honor to help create something so meaningful. The revelation continued to ripple through the diner as word spread about the true meaning behind Sarah's tattoo. What had started as a moment of potential embarrassment and judgment had transformed into something approaching a ceremony of recognition and respect. Commander Mitchell stood silently for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Sarah's tattoo. The entire diner watched as this distinguished military officer, a man who had commanded troops in multiple deployments and earned numerous commendations, processed what he was seeing. Then, without warning, Commander Mitchell did something that shocked everyone present. He stepped back, came to attention, and rendered a slow, deliberate salute. The gesture was profound and unmistakable. This wasn't a casual acknowledgement or polite recognition. This was a formal military salute, the kind reserved for fallen heroes and sacred memorials. Commander Mitchell held the salute for a full 10 seconds, his eyes fixed on the names tattooed on Sarah's arm. The other 5 officers immediately followed suit, stepping back and rendering their own salutes in perfect formation. The sight of 6 high-ranking military officers saluting a young waitress in a roadside diner was surreal and deeply moving. Sarah stood frozen, overwhelmed by the unexpected honor being shown to her brother's memory. Tears streamed down her face as she realized that for the first time since getting the tattoo, someone understood what it truly represented. The salute seemed to last forever, but eventually Commander Mitchell lowered his hand and spoke in a voice thick with emotion. Miss Martinez, your brother was a true hero, and what you've done to honor him and his fallen brothers is extraordinary. This is not just body art. This is a living memorial to American heroes. He turned to address the other customers in the diner, his command voice carrying clearly through the small space. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're looking at is one of the most respectful and meaningful tributes to our fallen service members that I've ever seen. This young woman has carried the names and faces of 7 American heroes on her body for months, enduring criticism and judgment from people who didn't understand the sacred nature of what she was bearing. The diner customers listened in respectful silence as the commander continued. Sergeant Marcus Martinez died protecting his men. Private First Class Tyler Henderson died trying to save his sergeant. These weren't just soldiers. They were brothers who sacrificed everything for each other and for our freedom. Miss Martinez has ensured that their sacrifice will never be forgotten. He turned back to Sarah, his expression filled with respect and admiration. Your brother would be proud of what you've done, not just the tattoo, but the way you've handled the ignorance and judgment with dignity. That takes the same kind of courage Marcus showed in combat. Sarah wiped her eyes, struggling to find words adequate for the moment. I just wanted people to remember them, she said quietly. Marcus always said his biggest fear wasn't dying. It was being forgotten. He worried that if something happened to him, people would move on and forget the sacrifice he and his brothers were willing to make. They will never be forgotten, Commander Mitchell assured her. Not as long as you carry them with you. One of the other officers, a colonel named Davidson, stepped forward. Miss Martinez, I hope you'll consider attending tomorrow's memorial ceremony. We're honoring fallen heroes from multiple conflicts, and I believe your brother's story and your dedication to preserving his memory would be meaningful to the families attending. Sarah looked surprised. You would want me there? We would be honored to have you there, Davidson replied. What you've done represents the best of what it means to remember and honor our fallen. The families of other service members would be inspired by your dedication. Commander Mitchell nodded in agreement. I'd like to personally invite you to sit with the families of the fallen. You understand their loss in a way that most people never will. The invitation was more than Sarah had ever dared to hope for. After months of hiding her tattoo and enduring criticism, she was being invited to a formal military ceremony as an honored guest. I would be privileged to attend, Sarah said, her voice steady despite her emotions. Commander Mitchell reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a card. This is my contact information. I want you to call me next week. I have connections in the technology industry, people who understand honor and service. Your skills shouldn't be wasted because of small-minded people who can't see past their own prejudices. He handed her the card, then addressed the room one final time. I want everyone here to understand something important. When you see someone with military-themed tattoos, don't assume you know their story. This young woman has more honor and respect for our military than most people will ever demonstrate. She's a Gold Star family member who has chosen to carry the memory of fallen heroes with her every day. The other customers nodded solemnly, clearly moved by the evening's revelations. Several approached Sarah after the officers returned to their table, offering apologies and expressing newfound respect for what her tattoo represented. The truck driver who had thanked her earlier came back, with tears in his eyes. My unit lost good men in Vietnam, he said quietly. I've never seen anyone honor fallen brothers the way you have. Thank you for keeping their memory alive. An elderly woman who had been dining alone approached hesitantly. My grandson is serving overseas, she said. If something ever happened to him, I would want someone like you to remember him. Thank you for what you've done. As the evening wound down, Commander Mitchell and his officers prepared to leave. Before departing, the commander approached Sarah one final time. Miss Martinez, I want you to know that what happened here tonight will be shared with others in the military community. Your story needs to be told, not just because it honors your brother, but because it challenges people to look beyond surface appearances and recognize true dedication. He paused, then added with a slight smile, and I suspect that after tomorrow's ceremony, you'll find that the world looks at you quite differently. Honor has a way of being recognized once people understand what they're seeing. After the officers left, Sarah finished her shift in a daze. The diner slowly returned to its normal late-night rhythm, but the atmosphere had changed. Customers treated her with a respect and reverence that felt strange after months of judgment and criticism. Carol, the manager, approached her near the end of the shift. Sarah, honey, I owe you an apology. I asked you to hide who you are because I was worried about what people might think. I never bothered to learn what your tattoo really meant. It's okay, Sarah replied. How could you have known? That's just it, Carol said. I should have asked. I should have taken the time to understand before making assumptions. As Sarah drove home in the early morning hours, she reflected on how completely her life had changed in a single evening. For months, she had carried the weight of constant judgment, hiding a memorial that meant everything to her because others couldn't see past their preconceptions. Now, for the first time since getting the tattoo, she felt proud to wear it openly. Tomorrow, she would attend a military ceremony as an honored guest, representing not just her brother's memory, but the memories of all the fallen heroes whose names she carried. Most importantly, she had learned that there were people in the world who understood honor and sacrifice, who could recognize the sacred when they saw it. Commander Mitchell's salute had been more than just a gesture. It had been a validation of everything she had endured to keep her brother's memory alive. Sarah pulled into her apartment complex and sat in her car for a moment, looking at her tattoo in the dim light. The faces of the fallen soldiers seemed to look back at her with approval, and she could almost hear Marcus's voice telling her that he was proud of what she had done. For the first time in months, Sarah smiled as she rolled up her sleeves and walked to her apartment door. no longer hiding the memorial that honored 7 American heroes who would never be forgotten.